And a very good evening to some of you. Good afternoon to some of you. Good night to some of you. Welcome to all of you. Politics 101 on a Tuesday evening. A Tuesday evening. The morning after, the day after, the night after, depending on where you are coming from. It was budget day yesterday. Of course, we spent our time remembering Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. yesterday, and we did touch a little bit on what to expect on the budget, in the budget, and the budget is here. A big budget, as we anticipated. Oh my God! Oh my God! A big budget. You're talking about trillion, eh? 1.146 trillion. Here, let me tell you all something. I never thought that I would live to hear a Guyana budget in the trillions. You all hear me? Almost $1.2 trillion budget. The government is intending to spend at a minimum $1.2 trillion. We know that in 3 months' time, they're going to be going back to get money from the consolidated fund. We're talking about, by the end of the year, close to $2 trillion these people are going to be spending. Here, that's a lot of money. A lot of money. A lot of money. And so when I hear some of you out say, nothing has changed in Guyana, a lot has changed. It's whether it's changed for the better or for the worse. But things have changed. Don't let no politician tell you all nothing has changed. Also, despite the fact that we have a horrible oil contract, we could have gotten more, of course. But despite a bad contract, we got plenty money. Don't let people tell you all that Guyana don't have plenty money. We got plenty money. You're talking about $1.2 trillion budget. Welcome to you all. Welcome. Look, I got me young friend, Elson Lowe, one of my favorite persons. You all know I wear my favoritism on my face. I was about to say on my shoulder, on my sleeves that you always talk about, right? Elson Lowe is here to break this all down for us. Welcome. And I notice you all are coming in fast tonight. And I love it. I love it because we're going to be talking about money tonight. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening to all of you. Wherever you're joining us from, if you're joining us from the west side, whether it's West Bank, West Coast, or you know a part of it, then you go over Burusiri. When I was a little boy and you're going on tour on the West Coast, when you're passing Burusiri, you say, wow, we there in Essequibo now. And when you're going east to excursion, in those days I used to go with my auntie to excursion at Belladrum and them place, and you're going with train, and you pass a Barry Creek. You say, bye, you're in Bobby Snow. Burusiri, around the area where you pass it, they say, you're gone now to East Bank, Essequibo. It's all the west side, from Parika. In fact, some people tell me, don't let out the islands, the Essequibo Islands, when you talk about the west side. Good evening to all you wonderful people on the west side. Beautiful people. My most favorite, oh God, you must not say that when you're into politics. Don't say why is your favorite. But I love the people of Denhamstel. It don't mean that I don't like Stroudville. or Virgin Nugent, or Podrine, or Stanley Tongue, or Sisters, Wales, Nimes, Metamirzorg, CI. I love all of those places, but I have a soft spot for Den Amstel, only because I get people in Den Amstel. As a little boy, I used to be in Den Amstel spending my August holiday, not summer holidays. Nowadays, you're all talking about summer. Right? August holidays. And we used to be there in Den Amstel spending August holidays by my cousins. And so Den Amstel really goes deep. Good evening, Rhonda, if you are joining us. Good evening, Rhonda Lane, and all my good friends from Den Amstel. I'm hoping to visit soon. I've not been there in months. The last time I was there was during the August holidays. And in nowadays time, that's a long time. Good evening to all of you. They haven't been to Stroudville in a little while. I flock Cashba. I haven't been to those places in a little while. The Americans say in a minute, and I suppose Guyanese say that too. Welcome to all of you. I see my sister Lynette, she early for class. Lynette Greenwood, you don't make jokes. You early for class. And a lot of you early because you want to pay about the money. 1 point, how much? Almost $1.2 trillion. And you know they're going to raid the consolidated fund just now. So it's going to go up. A lot of money. Don't let people tell you all that Guyana got plenty money. And don't let people tell you all nothing has changed. If we get a budget of $1.2 trillion, plenty has changed. It's whether it's changed for the better or for the worse. We had something in Guyana called for better or for worse. I think, I want me historians help me, for better or for worse. Was it a radio serial? I can't remember. My mind is telling me I think it's a radio serial, but I need my historians to help me out here, for better or for worse. Something on the radio was called for better or for worse. Good evening to the East Coast people. I am always guilty of leaving out where I come from. I'm an East Coast man. In particular, I'm a Buxtonian. Good evening to all the Buxtonians. Good evening to all the Buxtonians at home and abroad. You know what we used to say? When people gone to Brooklyn, because that's where a lot of people used to, when you go where you're gone to Brooklyn. And we other thing in Buxton, we used to say, when you left and you're gone to Brooklyn, it's like you're gone from Buxton to Annandale. Annandale or Annandale is next door to Buxton. Well, let me say part of Buxton, because Buxton is really Buxton Friendship, Vigilance, and Annandale South. All right? In the cultural sense. So when you left to go away to America, and Brooklyn invariably, we said, well, when you gone to Brooklyn, it's like you got from Buxton to Annandale, you just go over the sideline road. Because people in Brooklyn, there's no happening in Buxton, even before you, when you're there in Buxton. Good evening to all the Buxtonians, all the Annandale, Congo people, all them friendship people, friendship back damn side, friendship front side. Well, friendship front side is a different place. They don't open the window. Don't matter if you're getting beat and you're hollering, they pull the blind and a peep through. Then I open the window. If you're getting beat at back damn side or line side and you holler, you don't even holler two things. They will open the window, brah, 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 and they will run out. But front side people is a different kind of people, right? Then I open, peep through the blind, they will crack in the blind. Conservative people on the front side. And front side is from the public road, go back to the seawall. Boxing front, friendship front. And then you get back down side is from the embankment to the Back dam. Well, no people live inside the back dam. You used to get pan dam. When you meet pan dam, you're done. You gone into the back dam. No people live in the back dam. And so, good evening to all of you Golden Grove people, and Anns Grove, and Belfield, and all. Good evening, Berbice. Good evening, Quarantine. Welcome to Politics 101. We're going to begin to talk about the budget tonight. And we have young Elson Lowe, who's here with us. Dennis Atwell, good evening. Dennis, I know Dennis is a tongue man, but he just said he's not a tongue man. He's really Essequibo. You see, tongue people is really country people come to tongue. Like Linden people is really East Coast and West Bobby's people who got to Linden. We mix up. Good evening. Welcome to Politics 101. I love all of you, although I have some soft spots. We do love all of you. And we welcome you to Politics 101. $1.1 trillion, 1.146 to be precise. Trillion, you know. Trillion. There's not 3 cents money. There's plenty money. Welcome to Politics 101. If you're joining us from outside of Guyana, if you're joining us from the wider Caribbean, hearty welcome to you. Wherever you're joining us from, whether you're joining us from Barbados, or you're joining us from Grenada, or St. Vincent, or St. Lucia, or St. Kitts, and some of you in Nevis. When I went to St. Kitts, Nevis for the first time 20 odd years ago, and Guyanese in St. Kitts, I think they had a restaurant there. But when I go across the Nevis, that's where you had a lot of Guyanese, because they were still doing cane. They were still planting cane in Nevis. And a lot of Guyanese went there to work in the sugar industry, and they were over in Nevis. So to all the Nevisians, good evening, and welcome to Politics 101. Antigans, well, I hit up the Antigans at least once a week, because I'm on a radio program there once a week in Antigua. And Guyanese are there. You know, they say that, you know, when Guyana and Antigua playing a football match, it's like 2 home team playing. Yes, our people are all over, and so it should be. Good evening to you. I see the Peterkins are out tonight. Lou Peterkins, them is Haslington people. You know that in the days, not so long ago, that was the spot to be on Thursday night karaoke. Those are the early days of karaoke. The Peterkins, they had the first karaoke, one of the first karaoke's on the East Coast, and I remember we used to go there on Thursday night. I think Sister Robin as our daycare center there, you know, and so on. But the Peterkins, they're all one family, and I see they're out in numbers tonight. Good evening to all of you. Morna Peterkin used to be a member of parliament, so they have pedigree. Good evening, good night. Welcome to Politics 101. All you all in Brooklyn and Toronto and Washington, D.C. and Maryland and South Carolina and Georgia on my mind, especially Atlanta. I won't say the first time I went to Atlanta, 37 years ago. Oh, Jesus Christ. It's something there like a balili. Something there. I never see so many beautiful black women in one place. Like when I went to Atlanta 37 years ago. Little boy, I was a young little boy, and thing I hear and so on. I saw me there like a balili. You there? I think so. It was quite an experience. Good evening to all you wonderful people in Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, Georgia. Good evening. The Robertsons, my favorite people, my cousins. I had the pleasure of meeting them in Arizona a couple of years ago, well, at least a year ago. Good evening to all of you. Good evening to my people in my neighborhood in Arizona, and some of you in California next door, and some of you in Texas. Good evening and welcome to Politics 101. We are going to be dissecting the budget tonight. Nowadays, they don't use the word no more dissecting. They say you're unpacking. You know, academics just come up with these and they sell themselves as new words, you know. And when they go back, they find that the great grandfather and so on, they use them word a long time. But the word now is unpacking. A couple of years ago, we just said dissecting and so on. Anyhow, one of the things they always say is that we don't give young people a chance. And I don't want them to run in the mouth to says David Hines are talking about, because I like to give young people a chance. Good evening, Wayne Caesar. Good. I owe Wayne to go on to the program. You see, when I go on to Ben Shop program, all the time it's Ben Shop. And I promise to go on when Wayne running things. Wayne, it's going to be shortly. I promise you. When Mark was trying to get me to come on with you, I was having a good time with my family, them in Maryland, and they said to me, no politics. And when you're in politics since you're in short pants, and your family, they allow you to be in dangerous politics too. And when you get in to be a big man, an old man, and they say, well, all right, you ain't doing it today, you got to listen. Because they loan you for 50, 60 years. And so now, when they pull the family thing and say, and no politics today, you got to listen, especially to the nieces and nephews and so on and so forth. All right, I think we are ready to roll. A young man, Elson Lowe, he's no stranger to this program, should be no stranger to you all. You always tell me, he bright bad. And I know when Guyanese said, he bright bad. It's not just he bright bad. I know what it means. So let's bring in young Elson Lowe. Young Elson Lowe, good evening.
Good evening to you.
They ever stop you in Georgetown or anywhere and tell you bright bad?
Word, they don't stop me, but word gets back to me one or
What get back to you? Bush Gates.
Yeah.
Well, here we are, 1.146 million, almost 2, not million, trillion. You hear my mouth? I in the million times, even billion can't come out of me mouth easy these days, much more trillion. It's a big budget. It's last year it was 700 and something. I think the budget this year has grown by what, 40%? Anyhow, talk to us about the size of the budget.
Yeah, absolutely. The budget has grown 46%. We've now seen 3 budgets that have grown in excess of 40% year over year. That has meant that this budget is around about 3 times as large as a budget from only a couple of years ago, and several times as large even as budgets that the coalition had put forward. I think I previously made a remark that last year's spending was equivalent almost to 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, and 2014's budgets combined, and this just adds perhaps another year onto that long list. That is quite a substantial amount of funding, and I think that it has exposed, which is perhaps why the PUP has been a little less enthusiastic than we might have thought in announcing this $1 trillion number. It has exposed really that the government is unbelievably stingy and has really no interest in the average Guyanese standard of living. This budget, first of all, some of the provisions that were made are so minuscule when compared with the size of the budget that they're shocking. $3,000 increase for pension, or that's $100 a day you're looking at there. $5,000 increase for the Because We Care cash grant, which is again, a very small increase. If that Because We Care cash grant had increased at the same rate as the national budget, it would have been more like $51,000, not the $40,000 that it is. Pensioners, instead of receiving $15,000 that you would have expected to see if the rate of pension increase had matched the rate of increase of the budget, $3,000. And that, of course, ignores that previous years you've seen sharp increases in these budgets. So that I think has thrown people off. But some of the top line numbers as well are very alarming. We're seeing the
Yes.
government again spend this time spend $204 billion on roads and bridges.
$204 billion on infrastructure, public works.
Roads and bridges.
Yes.
Now, it seems to me that really is a question or a good statement of the government's priorities, because that is much more than they're spending on education,
Yes.
much more than they're spending on healthcare,
Healthcare.
and it's not some small.
And even agriculture.
Absolutely. I mean, if you combine the spending in agriculture and education, or so, you'll get a similar number. The spending in agriculture and healthcare, you'll get a similar number. My point really being that, yes, I understand roads and bridges are important, infrastructure is important, but I don't know if it's that important that you should be spending nearly twice as much on it as you're spending on healthcare or education and so on. That to me is very much alarming. And it reflects what I think many citizens are concerned about, which is that those infrastructure projects are a primary conduit for corruption, and money for the boys, as we say, friends, family, favorites, and PvP elites. Whereas in education, it's kind of hard for you to have quite the same extent of level of corruption. I think it's useful at this point to remind Guyanese that the president told the United Nations that they'd spend 20% of our national budgets on education. Now we're looking at a very small, an allocation almost half that. I think it's like 11-12% that's being spent on education, the share of the budget that's being spent. They said they'd spend 20% of the budget on education. That is so concerning in light of this particular fact. Since Guyana has begun to include oil revenues in its national budgets, we've continued to see a drop, a decline in the percentage of the budget that is spent on education. We used to see 15-16% spent on education before oil. And now with oil, you're seeing 13%, 12%, 11%, a decline. That to me indicates that the government doesn't see education as particularly important relative to the other items in the budget. And given the vast and significant role that education has played in the growth of so many countries and in the success of so many individuals, that to me is very alarming, and it's a trend that has continued. So it's a large budget, but it doesn't have much for ordinary people in terms of a lot of the increases that were expected, and it demonstrates priorities which are wrong-headed and which are troubling.
But it reflects where the government's head is in terms of its vision for Guyana, if you can call it a vision, in terms of its priorities, the word you used, in terms of its economic philosophy, in terms of how it intends to distribute resources. And I am coming back to that in a minute. You talked about old age pension, etc., etc. Some of those are some of the first things people look for. Now, one of the things that you and the opposition have been talking about was the raising of the tax ceiling. The government has raised the tax ceiling. Not enough as you think it should be raised, but they've raised it. Tell us what is positive about that and what is negative about it, if there is anything positive about it.
Well, they have raised the tax ceiling from $85,000 to $100,000, saying that 13,000 people will benefit. That, when we've got a workforce of hundreds of thousands of people, to me is, pennies. Really, it is a minimal measure. We have previously said that the tax threshold needed to be moved from $85,000 to $150,000, and we believe that from there it should go even higher. The reason that we're saying that is, I mean, let's be real here. We don't believe that anybody who is earning $150,000 a month in Guyana should be paying taxes. That is a very minimal amount of money, and juxtaposed against the fact that Guyana has adjusted for prices, an income per capita that is in the top 10 in the entire world, to be asking people who are barely making $150,000 a month to be paying taxes, I think is manifestly absurd. But that is what the government is doing. Really, some people were hopeful that there would be big budgets and there'd be big changes. But what you've seen from the PUP is a policy of limited incrementalism, a 5,000, a 3,000, a 15,000, these kinds of small numbers, as opposed to something substantial and significant. This, I think, has concerned a lot of people. One of the other reasons that we want to see a substantial change in that tax threshold is because we want to encourage Guyanese to seek work. We want to increase that labor force participation rate. We want to get more Guyanese working. We want to encourage them through greater reward from their work to seek work and to be engaged in our economy. If we're just having very minimal increases in the tax threshold, you can understand the average Guyanese might say to themselves, or that many Guyanese might say to themselves that it's not worth it, that their expenses associated with work, it doesn't make sense to travel and so on and so forth. So, and we would point out that there are economic studies that have indicated that policies similar to raising the tax threshold and so on, like the earned income tax credit in the United States, has demonstrated, first of all, an increase in labor force participation, and second of all, that it has substantially decreased poverty in the United States where it's been enacted. So that to me is the way that this should be approached. It again seems that the government doesn't understand or doesn't want to understand that we're in the big leagues now. We have more oil per person than every country except for one. Why would you be asking people who are struggling to get by to pay taxes? That to me is absurd.
It is absurd. Elson Lowe here walking us through the budget. It's only a day after the budget. Of course, they will dissect it a little bit more later, but we're getting some preliminary responses here. Good evening to you, Candy, Naleen, Indarijit from Skeldon, Corriverton area. And I know there are some places I forget when I talk. And of course, you ought not to forget Skeldon and Corriverton. Skeldon, Corriverton, from that number 72, go right back, and so on. I remember my first time visiting Skeldon, it was 1972. I was a little schoolboy. I've met some of my schoolmates from Colin Burke and them from Colin Burke. If you're listening, you remember 1972. We went to Crabwood Creek on a school tour, a 1 week tour, or 2 weeks, I think. But we had to stop in Skeldon on our way to Crabwood Creek. And as little boys, in those days, Skeldon Cricket Ground used to host Shell Shield cricket, first class cricket. And it was one of the fastest pitches in Guyana. And we remember as soon as we got to Skeldon, we wanted to go to the Skeldon Cricket Ground because as small boys, we were into cricket. Skeldon, Corriverton. If you're talking about mixed people, Elson, you have an interest in this. You're really talking about mixed people. There's a article that a lot of mixed people. But I think Corriverton, Skeldon area get more mixed people than I have seen in any part of the of Guyana, including Bartica. It's if you're saying mixed people are really the face of a diverse Guyana, go to Skeldon, Corriverton area there. Dime a dozen. Good evening to all the people from Skeldon, Corriverton. Elson, let's get back here to this budget. Now, I am biased. All of us have our bias. As I listened to parts of the budget speech, I couldn't bear the entire 5 hours. But as I perused later on in the night, the numbers and trying to see what's in front of the numbers, what behind the numbers, my own bias was driving me. And I was looking for wage relief for working people to deal with the high cost of living. I was looking for measures that are intended to bring down the poverty rate. After all, depends on who you're talking to, our poverty rate will range from late 30s to almost 50%, depending on who. But that's high for a country of our economic profile. So I was looking, was there some cost of living relief in this budget? Was there something to do with bringing poverty down? Of course, you don't look at naked numbers and see those things. That's why we have people like you to tell us what's behind. Is there anything there that, anything substantial to bring cost of living relief? Let's deal with that first, because that is front and center of all Guyanese concern. The high prices, the high cost of living. We ain't get into inflation yet, but let's talk about the cost of living, the high prices and so on. And you are having a 1.14 budget, $1 trillion budget. Is there anything substantial for cost of living relief, and where can we find it?
Yeah, well, one of the things that's to me is indicative of whether or not a government takes seriously these issues is, does the government talk about them? What we observed is the finance minister, I think maybe once he mentioned poverty, maybe once cost of living as well, not mentioned anywhere near as much as it should have been mentioned. And to that end, anti-poverty measures are, absent almost in their entirety, really. Public assistance, I suppose you could say, is an anti-poverty measure. But even then, $100 a day more in public assistance. I mean, what are we doing? That's the first thing. The second thing is that when it comes to the dealing with the cost of living, the PPP has insisted on keeping direct cost of living mitigation to these sort of really ridiculous numbers: $5 billion for 2 years, and then now $7 billion, as if that is anywhere near enough. Folks, that is again not even 1% of the national budget, not even 1% during the most difficult cost of living crisis in 40 years. To that end, one of the concerns that has been raised, and I know you just touched on inflation, but it is something that we have to talk a bit more now, because two or three things that the Minister for Finance mentioned that were really alarming. The first was the minister indicated that there's a 2.5% expected inflation rate for 2024. This comes on the back of the government saying that it was 2% inflation last year. Now, to give your viewers some context, 2% inflation is what economists would target typically as your rate of inflation you'd be okay with. Now, that basically means they have no meaningful inflation. It's not affecting things. So it means then that the government is trying to tell the Guyanese people that they don't think that prices are going up in Guyana. They just don't believe that they're going up at all. And if they don't believe that prices are going up, why would they take any measures to address the fact that prices are going up? That to me is very alarming, because it means that there's no help on the horizon. The government does not even accept that these prices are going up. Now, last year, at the end of 2020, the 2023 budget speech, I had calculated about 7% inflation. We're seeing from the US State Department an indication of 6.6% inflation. So that seems to me to be spot on. What's happening is the rate at which they're increasing spending without the commensurate measures to deal with the inflation problem and to bring down the cost of living has caused this to persist. For those of you, your viewers who are any interest in economics, the finance minister said that the minister for finance, I can't call him the finance minister, said that the money supply has been increased by 25%. Now, that means that there's far more dollars, a quarter more dollars, chasing the same amount of goods or an increase in goods. In order for there, roughly, I mean, there are other factors that have to be looked at. But in order for you really to have no inflationary effect, you'd have to have had a growth in the non-oil sector across many areas of 25% as well, in order to match 25% more dollars in the economy. But that's not what we've seen. So essentially, we've got more dollars chasing fewer goods, which is pushing up the price of items across Guyana. What this, of course, means is the government has to have much more focus on reducing prices, on adding efficiencies, on productivity, things that we have stressed repeatedly. Competition, bringing down prices via competition. We've stressed those things repeatedly, and it's gone on deaf ears. We've also talked about direct measures to bring down the price of transportation. That could be transportation for school children. I believe that's something you mentioned. It could be transportation, as I've mentioned before, from the farm to the market, vouchers for canter operators and non-operators to provide them with lower fuel prices. Those are all mechanisms that could be taken to deal with this issue. But rather, the government is pumping a lot of money into there and not putting money towards those improvements, those changes. In fact, that 7 billion allocation, they have said that they will say what exactly they'll do with the 7 billion after consultation. Now, for you to say that you're putting aside 7 billion and not to say what you're going to use the $7 billion for, says to me that either number one, you were never particularly interested in the issue. You barely put a few fricks. Or number two, that you don't really know how to solve the issue. You don't know what to do. And so you say, you'll consult and so on. It sounds like you don't really know what to do at all. In addition to that, last year, the government's 5 billion that was set aside to direct cost of living mitigation, they didn't use that money all year long. It is only in the last month of the year, that there was a sort of a one-off cash grant. Now, again, during such a painful cost of living crisis, you're not going to use the monies that you yourself set aside to deal with the cost of living crisis. You're going to wait until the last month. And then now, when you do a slightly larger allocation, you are not going to indicate what you're going to do this allocation. It sounds like it's going to be a repeat of last year, but they have no real interest in the cost of living crisis. They're not going to make use of the few funds set aside for it. And as a result, the crisis will persist, and they will pretend that there's no crisis and say, 2% inflation, everything is fine, prices are not going up. It's an illusion. So, when Guyanese go to the market, I don't have to tell them that prices have been going up and things have been getting more difficult. I don't have to tell them that. Everyone is aware of that. And the government's continued focus on pumping large amounts of money into the economy without the appropriate programs to mitigate those negative effects is driving inflation now in Guyana.
Elson, before we get off the cost of living thing, something came to my attention in the last few weeks, thanks to my constant conversations with Professor Clive Thomas, is that even the very cost of living is not uniform, that there are some regions in the country where the cost of living is higher, the rate of cost of living or cost of living itself is higher, prices are higher than in other places. Explain that for us. Explain that difference.
Absolutely. The cost of living is often very much related to the price of oil, the price of gasoline. And so an example of where that would be particularly important is with food in rural areas where you have to travel quite a long way. That therefore means that you have fuel expenses to go into those rural areas in order to provide goods. So the price of a loaf of bread on the coast is totally different than the price of a loaf of bread in the interior. because of the fuel cost, and because, of course, we've not got as robust infrastructure as we really need to enable us to operate. The price of fuel, similarly, is much higher in the interior. So that's why there are areas in Guyana, especially interior areas, where the cost of living is very high, and where there's particularly difficult circumstances that citizens are faced with. Again, as I just indicated, to my mind, vouchers for those who are transporting food to bring down the cost of transporting that food is a very obvious policy, and we've indicated that that could even be funded by the windfall oil price that you saw in 2022, where the war in Ukraine, you saw $60 billion that we didn't anticipate. We were able to receive. So we could easily have mobilized that to deal with these types of mechanisms. Now, if you look at last year's allocation, the year before, this year's, you're talking about 5 and 7. I mean, that's what, $17 billion. I've just mentioned $60 billion that we didn't even expect that was available. So we could have certainly made use of that $60 billion instead of these minimal amounts. I mean, a fraction of the money that was that we received as a windfall. And that's not to mention that overall, I believe the finance minister, I could be incorrect, but I believe he said $82 a barrel was the average oil price Guyana received last year. Now, Guyana's expected long-term oil price was $50 a barrel for many years. Under the coalition, that was the discussion. Now it's $65 a barrel is the discussion. But we're looking at $82 a barrel, which is far higher than that. So what it
Mhm.
means is that the government has been raking in additional revenues as a result of has been raking additional revenues as a result of the high oil price. That same high oil price has been pushing up the cost of living by causing goods to be much more expensive to transport. And so people have been suffering. So they've been receiving all the negatives, but not the positives of being an oil producer in a high oil price environment. This is a tragedy, and really it goes to show that the government, number one, has no idea what it's doing, but number two, has not taken the time or doesn't have the interest in looking at how it can really mobilize these resources to help people through this difficult time.
In case you're just joining us, yes, it's Politics 101, and we have young Elson Lowe here tonight, helping us to make sense of this massive budget that was announced yesterday by the government of Guyana. It's in the trillions now, so you all got to get your tongue around the T. You know, it's no longer just M and B, it's now you're talking about trillions of dollars. Elson, we all were shocked a few weeks ago, a month, maybe a couple of months ago, but certainly a few weeks ago, when we had that report. I think it was the United Nations report that talked about the state of health and nutrition in Guyana. Our babies were born in Guyana really scored very badly. And a government is supposed to know that before it was published, but even if it didn't know it, it would have heard it. And any government is supposed to be thinking about the welfare of the people. Now, in our part of the world, when you're talking about welfare of our people, the first things that come to mind is health and education. And we've dealt with education and how much they don't think about education. Healthcare, they've allocated $129 billion, about 10% or 11 or 12%. Education is 135. So they're in the same neighborhood. If after that report, would we not expect the government to make health much more a priority than it has made it here?
No, you're quite right. Some of the policies we've advocated, like the salary top up, where citizens will get a little extra on top of their salary to help them to make ends meet. That's similar to the policy called Bolsa Familia in Brazil, which has been shown to reduce malnutrition, childhood malnutrition, very sharply. I think by like 30% or something like that. Very sharply reduce childhood malnutrition. Even has been shown to improve test scores. But that is just an example of where we believe that citizens are struggling to get by, and that's a factor that has contributed to childhood malnutrition in Guyana. I believe the report had indicated that in the Caribbean, Guyana is the highest rate of childhood malnutrition,
Yes, yes,
the Caribbean and South America. Now, the other side of this is we've called for 2 hot meals to be provided to students. Again, to provide number one, direct food to the students to ensure they're taken care of, but also to serve as a bit of assistance to parents who may be struggling to make ends meet. To me, that is vital. The way that the government has decided to focus, where the government has decided to focus its revenues, is in the building of more and more hospitals, so more
yes.
infrastructure. Now, that really is quite absurd for an interesting reason. The government is also complaining of a shortage of nurses and doctors and so on. And now, if you, with your existing number of hospitals, you have a shortage of nurses and doctors. If you expand the number of hospitals, it is obvious that you'll have even more of a shortage, so that people will be showing up to hospitals and looking left and looking right, and there's no nurses in there, no doctors in there. It's them alone in the hospital. That is just a classic example of poor planning. The government still has refused to provide appropriate wages to public servants, nurses, and doctors, especially to ensure that we stem the tide of nurses and doctors, nurses in particular, leaving Guyana. They've mentioned they're going to train 2,000 more nurses, but if you don't increase the salaries, all that's happening, as was mentioned in the course of the minister's presentation, someone shouted out that all that's happening is that you're training nurses for export because the nurses aren't going to stay; they're not being properly compensated. We even heard the president speaking to a journalist from the UK, saying, "Oh, you're taking our nurses from us." But I just like to make the president aware that adjusting for prices, Guyana is on the purchasing power level. Guyana is a far wealthier country than the United Kingdom in terms of income per capita. We've blown straight past them; they're not in the conversation anymore. So for him to be saying that to someone from the United Kingdom, I think is first of all very ironic, but second of all very tragic. It shows that he has no idea of what is really going on in Guyana. And by next year, we're going to be up amongst the very top, one or two, or higher than the top, in terms of income per capita at purchasing power in the entire world. And some will say, "Oh, it's just a number. It doesn't really mean anything." But I just would like to point this out. We've seen Guyana's economy more than triple in only a few years. We've seen Guyana's government budget more than triple in only a few years. So if people are making the argument that the monies aren't available to pay public servants, to pay nurses and so on, well, clearly there's money available because the government has more than tripled. The government has more than tripled spending that was going on only a couple of several years ago. So if money is available, if the economy is growing, why is it we're not seeing those monies allocated to meet the needs that are obvious to everyone, apparently except for the government? This, to me, is again a symptom of poor planning and of the young people would say bad mindedness, but I'm not given to using such terminology. What I'd say is the government is not looking out for citizens in the way that they should. And to that end, where we're spending more money, we're not necessarily going to see progress. It's not just about physical buildings; it's about the people that are within the buildings.
People that are within the building, whether those buildings are hospitals or school buildings or roads. And it is not that Elson or I or anyone outside of the aisle, it is not that we have anything against building more hospitals and building more schools, but you have to also invest in other aspects of the healthcare system or the education system, as the case may be. You have to think systemically. For this government, look a building, and everybody can see the building, and they're playing on the kind of weaknesses in our instincts, because when you come from small societies like ours, you're not accustomed to seeing big shiny buildings and all these fancy road networks and so on. And so when you see semblance of it in your country, you instinctively tend to think, well, we have arrived. We have arrived, right? Because we now have roads like New York. And we now have hospitals that look like the one in Toronto and Canada and so on. They play on that aspect of our instinct. And I think that is so tragic to use the term. As I was listening to the presentation on the investment in healthcare and the health industry and the health sector, I couldn't help but saying, is Ashley Singh and Frank Anthony, are they in the same party and the same government? Because I'm sure you listened to Frank Anthony's year-end report on the health sector. And when he said what he said about the shortage of nurses in our hospitals, you then understand why so many people are dying foolishly in our because if you walk into a hospital that is supposed to be staffed by 20 nurses and there are only 2 or 3 nurses, you're in trouble. You're really walking in there to die. And Frank Anthony's report reflected that. Ashley Singh's budget allocation for the health sector does not reflect that. And it is so tragic to use your term again, because what we have is a government that is hard-ass, a government that is intolerant, a government that the left side of its brain don't go with the right side of its brain, a government that is all over the place, and a government that is a big con. Because in many regards, I think some of them know. Whatever you say about Jack Dio understands applied economics. He may not be a student of economics. He may not understand economic philosophy. He may not understand economic history, but he understands how you apply economics in things. So he's not an ignoramus when it comes to economics. So in some regards they know, but they don't care. And I think that is tragic to borrow your term again. Elson, at the end of the day, given where Guyana is, where Guyana has been, our concern and the concern of the government should be the condition of the people, in particular, the people in the lower brackets, the lower social brackets. And that whatever we do, whether it's the budget or whether we are talking about investments or whether we are talking about reforms, we always have to bear in mind the poor people, the poor classes of people. And as we look at this budget, can we safely say this is an anti-poor budget?
Absolutely, absolutely. To me, for you to announce a budget over $1 trillion Guyana dollars and almost never mention the word poverty, I mean, goodness me, there's so much fiscal space for the government to do something about poverty in Guyana. And the government is just choosing not to take any kind of systemic and structured action. We've called for a national poverty survey. We've called for additional analysis to be done, for people to be hired to conduct analysis to help government to properly evaluate various projects, as well as the question of poverty. And those cries have fallen on deaf ears. You use the expression "hard ears." That might be a useful expression to use. But the other thing I would say is just walking around Guyana, or you often come across people begging. Now, I mean, what frustrates me? What frustrates me? And people will say, "Oh, you're saying these numbers. Oh, the economy has grown, but doesn't mean anything." The budget has also grown. Why is it that we can't mobilize some share of this budget to help those in need? I want to say one other point here, because I think sometimes it gets lost, but it is very vital. We expected to see, or we were looking to see, finance for reforms, the hiring of experts and consultants, the hiring of thousands of young people to conduct analysis and gather data to help the government to manage, monitor, evaluate, and improve governance overall in this country. We have seen the government announce that last year's public sector investment program was something like on the out of 480 billion or so dollars, of which something like 170 billion was lost due to incompetence and corruption, based off of the IMF estimates and based off the IMF recommendations regarding reforms in Guyana, governance reforms, the recommendations that they may have made for years on end, which the government has not paid any attention to. In 2018, we began the process of reform, and the government doesn't have any interest in that. Now, as a result of that, we're seeing yet another public investment program in hundreds and hundreds of billions. No reform. So that means that we're going to see hundreds of billions wasted or stolen. Again, as we push forward into yet another budget, that may mean when you see delays on these roads, Cemetery Road is the delay that a lot of people are frustrated about right now. When you see delays with the schools that are being built, pump stations that are being built, those are all elements of this. But there's one central element of this hundreds of billions of dollars of poor management that we should highlight. First of all, if we save that money, we could, of course, be spending that money on poverty alleviation, even though we generally should be focusing on poverty alleviation. Why are we wasting hundreds of billions of dollars due to incompetence? Number one. But number two, just before this show came on, there was a low voltage for a prolonged period and a blackout. And we heard the Minister for Finance get up and say, the government increased capacity by 15%, generation capacity last year. But all year long, the government demand exceeded capacity. Now, what that means when it comes to electricity is blackout. You had more demand for electricity than you had electricity produced. Blackout. And for the government to come up and proudly say, the finance minister said, the government grew faster than expected, so the electricity consumption was more than expected. I'm thinking to myself, first things first. You mean to tell me that your planning, your approach is to have just enough electricity capacity to barely meet whatever the demands are, such that if there's a slight bit of growth more than you expect, is blackouts all over Guyana? That's your strategy? It costs millions of dollars I think it's like 700,000 US every single hour of lost labor productivity due to blackouts in this country. And the grid, of course, is the Demerara Berbice interconnect. Demerara and Berbice are huge. There's a huge number of people you're talking about. So the blackouts in Guyana are a serious issue. And then to hear the government say that the amount of additional generators that they've brought in will not be ready until February, not be fully functional until February, which means again we're going to be at risk of these types of blackouts all the way through to February, and I think beyond, because of course power consumption is growing all the time. Is really troubling. One of the things that the government said is they said that these generators would be available for Christmas. Dr. Hines, I don't know about you, but to my knowledge, Christmas does not fall in February. So this is really quite troubling.
Look, Elson, what a note to finish on. No, Christmas does not fall in February. February is mash time. Mash time, not Christmas time. And we will need quite a lot of energy in place for that. Elson, no, thank you so much for coming on and to help us to at least have some preliminary sense of what this large budget means. Thank you very much, and we will be calling upon you in the coming weeks to help us through more.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me again.
Thank you. And thanks to you for staying with us. We've got to make sure that we stay on time because we're sharing platforms with some of the other programs today. And so we've got to make sure that we get off on time. And it's that time. It's 8 o'clock. So until tomorrow night when we come again, I can't remember off the top of my head who we're having tomorrow night, but somebody's going to be on tomorrow night, and we're going to continue our conversation on this anti-poor budget, anti-poor people budget. Nothing in the budget to deal with the woes of our poor people. Until tomorrow night, stay good, stay true to the struggle, and remember, we love you all.